In 2016, Paradox Interactive released Hearts of Iron 4 as its latest installment in its popular World War II Grand Strategy series. At launch, the game was in a very bare-bones state, had a lot of bugs, lacked a lot of content, and had an AI that made it more of a seal clubbing simulator than a proper warfare and geopolitical game. However, with 7 years of patches and updates, I believe it has become the best game in the entire genre. Hoi 4 had a lot of improvements over its predecessor, Hearts of Iron 3. The biggest change was to the production system. The main difference between Hoi 3 and Hoi 4 is how you build units. In Hoi 3, you assign an arbitrary amount of IC for a certain amount of days, and your unit's complete. In Hearts of Iron 4, you have to build the individual equipments that each unit uses. You need the rifles, support equipment, trucks, artillery, tanks. Whatever you need for that unit, you have to produce in factories, and then you use that equipment to train units. While Hearts of Iron 3 did have an efficiency based building system, it wasn't quite as deep and didn't really quite match the detail that Hearts of Iron 4's system offered. Hearts of Iron 4 also has a much more robust multiplayer system. There's no need for port forwarding like you needed in Hearts of Iron 3. You just create a lobby and go. The co op system works really well, and the lobbies can actually hold quite a lot of people without many issues. Much to the chagrin of more serious wargamers, Hearts of Iron 4 was incredibly simplified. Hoi 3 had a very complex order of battle system which involved 6 layers of chain of command, each requiring different levels of generals and officers. That system was subbed out for Hoi 4's very simplified frontline system. You simply had to take your best general, promote him to a field marshal, and that was all you needed for general management. The upside to this was moving troops was much easier. Hearts of Iron 3 required a lot of effort in setting up different fronts and moving your formations without disrupting the incredibly complex chain of command. Now you could simply drag and drop units and they would appear on the front line of your choosing. The one area where I felt the streamlining had the most positive effect was the air system. Hoi 3 had an air system that involved assigning different wings to missions and required filling out an entire Excel spreadsheet just for your fighters to run an interception mission or your strategic bombers to go on a bombing campaign. Now, you could simply assign planes to an air zone and see advanced statistics on how well your fighters were performing, how much damage you were doing to buildings, and how much damage you were doing to different units. Overall, the system was a lot more transparent and easier to use, even if the air zones did have some limitations. Another major addition was focus trees. On launch, they served as a way to pick a fun bonus for your country every 90 days, but as the game progressed and updates were released, they turned into a way to shape your country's political landscape and choose a path for expansion, conquest, or finding allies. 6 months after release, Hearts of Iron 4 had its first expansion, Together for Victory. This expansion added various mechanics for puppets in game, as well as focus trees for all of the British Commonwealth. The update also included a lot of smaller additions, such as a battle log where you could see the results of previous combats and losses on both sides, new releasables, and also allowed anti aircraft guns to negate enemy air superiority penalties, thus making anti aircraft guns more useful in the game. Personally, I feel like this update was pretty lackluster. Although I was very excited when it released, it just didn't really have too much content mechanics wise, but it was a very good sign that development was going in the right direction post release. The next expansion that released was Death or Dishonor, and I personally feel like this was the most disappointing expansion that they released for the game. It did take 6 months for it to release, which was the same time that it took for Together for Victory, but it did not include quite as much content either. It had focus trees for 4 Central European nations and 2 game mechanics that I felt like didn't really add much to the game. While equipment conversion is cool, I didn't really see it used much, and I've really only see it used for cheese tactics. It's kind of more of a roleplay component, and while that's good, it wasn't really the need, a need of the game at that point in time. There was also tech sharing and model sharing, where you could basically buy the license to build another nation's tanks, planes, equipment, etc. But this also wasn't very useful because there was a large malice for using another nation's designs. The only way that it really was useful was just as a research boost, since most nations can produce their own tanks and aircraft pretty easily. So while this is a good feature, I feel like it's limited just by the fact that minor nations in this game have very overpowered research. After Death or Dishonor released, Paradox went kind of radio silent for a while, and it wasn't for almost 2 years. In spring of 2018 that we finally got Waking the Tiger. By this time, people had kind of been losing a lot of hope that the game would improve, but Waking the Tiger shut up a lot of the critics on the forums and on Reddit especially. So while this update did take a very long time to come out, it was easily the most impactful update and expansion that this game has had for its entire history. So while this update's big selling point was all of the flavor added to East Asia, with China and Japan all getting new focus trees and different events and all that, I think personally the biggest part of this update was just the little changes that Paradox made to the game and all of the kind of clunky systems where a lot of the bugs that had kind of plagued them, especially the front line system where you would make a front line and there would be a small gap in the line and your AI general, I guess, the frontline manager, the frontline AI would choose to take a unit all the way in the north and bring it all the way to the south. And this would cause a lot of chaos where you at some point had 50% of your units shuffling between lines when you were just had a lot of movement on your front lines. And this also affected the AI really badly. The AI would suffer, especially if you were micromanaging your own units. The AI would have at least 30% of its units out of action simply because they were shuffling. So while this update also made it better for the player and kind of made the AI controlling your front lines a more viable option versus complete micro, it also made the AI you fought against much more potent because now you didn't have to fight an AI that was constantly reshuffling. Now the AI had much more units actually at the front positioned, ready to defend or attack you. The command system was also completely overhauled. Instead of having one generic skill, generals now had four skills: logistics, planning, attack, and defense. So you could have a general that's very good at logistics or attack or defense, and they would level up randomly too, which I think adds a lot of depth. On top of this, you now actually needed generals. You could no longer just assign your best general as a field marshal and have him control every troop. Now, armies were limited to 24 soldiers, and each army required its own field marshal. Each field marshal could command up to 5 armies. While this chain of command system was not as deep as Hearts of Iron 3's, it was a lot simpler and required a lot less micromanaging while also adding a lot of depth that Hearts of Iron 3 had in its system. This update also added decisions into the game. It was kind of a weird design choice from Paradox to not include decisions on launch, but I think they had intended for the focus tree system to completely replace them, but then at some point realized that both could coexist in the game. While it was kind of annoying not to have them up until this patch, Paradox did do decisions justice by making them really fleshed out. There were a lot of options present in this patch, and it really felt like they were never missing from the game in the first place. Nameless were also added in this update, which proved to be a really big boost for immersion. No longer were you dealing with ahistorical and honestly downright nonsensical unit names such as anti-tank type 7, 8, 9, 10, etc., but now units drew from a historical name list and would be named appropriately. Acclimatization was added, which allowed your units to adapt to the cold or hot environments and reduce the malices from each respectively. The update also included a lot of fixes, tweaks, and UX improvements. The game felt a lot more polished, especially comparing to launch. At this point, I feel like Hearts of Iron 4 had finally surpassed Hearts of Iron 3 as being the best Hearts of Iron game. 11 months later, Hearts of Iron 4 would receive its naval expansion, Man the Guns. This added in a ship designer where you could design ships from a variety of modules and essentially make your own customized navy. It had a focus tree for the United States and a couple other minor nations. It also added in fuel, which should have been there from launch since it was in literally every other title, and the developers insisted that it being abstracted was a good thing, but hey, credit where credit is due, they finally listened and caved into the community and added in a proper fuel system. Almost a year later, Hearts of Iron 4 would have its espionage update, La Resistance. This added in a new resistance system that required more thought than just slapping 30 cavalry divisions on whatever conquered territories you had. Now you actually had to properly manage garrisons and resistance in your conquered territories. It also added in a proper espionage system. Hearts of Iron 3 had a very lackluster and bare espionage system that was kind of just tacked on. So it was really good to see Hearts of Iron 4 actually put effort in and really flesh out their espionage system. Battle for the Bosphorus was the next expansion to be released. It didn't add in anything mechanics wise, it only added in focus trees for Turkey, Greece, and Bulgaria. The next expansion was No Step Back, which came almost 2 years after La Resistance, the last actual gameplay expansion. This update was absolutely massive. It added in a supply system which used railways and supply hubs to get supplies to your units. And while the supply system isn't really that great and kind of has a lot of issues, it is better than the system that preceded it. This update also added in a general officer corps, which allowed you to take officers and assign them to advisory roles, giving your country passive bonuses. It also added in a tank designer, which, kind of like the ship designer, allowed you to research and apply various modules to your tanks to kind of give you a more custom feel to your army. The update also included focus trees for the Soviet Union and the Baltic states. It also reworked combat widths to make the current meta units a little less meta and add a little bit more variety to how you built units in game. 11 months after No Step Back launched, we would get a new expansion, By Blood Alone, which was an Italian and aircraft focused expansion. This expansion added in an aircraft designer, which was very similar to the naval designer and tank designer added in previous expansions. Italy would receive a new focus tree, and Switzerland and Ethiopia would get focus trees of their own. The peace conference mechanics were also significantly overhauled in a new peace bidding system, which I don't really think is a good system. It doesn't really work well, it has a lot of jank, but it is better than the old system, and I think it will do for now. Division commanders were also added in this update, which serve as a flavor mechanic more than an actual gameplay mechanic. You can give them medals, and when you recruit a general, they actually are pulled from your pool of divisions, which, while I think is cool, is kind of more of a flavor thing than anything else. 1 year later, the final gameplay expansion to Hearts of Iron 4, or at least the most recent gameplay expansion to Hoi 4 at the time of recording, would be released, Arms Against Tyranny. It's a Scandinavian focus update that adds focus trees to all countries in Scandinavia, including Finland, which I believe was really long overdue for a focus tree considering how important it was in World War II. They also added in military industrial organizations, which replaced the generic equipment designers that just give flat bonuses. Now you can really develop your nation's companies and design bureaus, having them design different equipments with research, and you can also have them produce different equipments. This in turn allows you to unlock different bonuses and really develop your country industrially in an even more in depth way than you could at launch. There's also a South American expansion, Trial of Allegiance, that just released pretty recently, but it's really only just a focus tree expansion and doesn't really add anything mechanically, so I'm not going to really talk too much about it. And that brings us to today. Hearts of Iron 4 is currently the most played grand strategy game on Steam, unless you count Civilization 6, which I personally don't think of as a grand strategy game, but could be considered one by some people. Anyways, I'll leave my beef with Civilization for another day. So, you might be wondering, why do I consider Hearts of Iron 4 to be the best strategy game that you can buy today? And the simple answer is that it does a lot of things right and it doesn't do a lot of things wrong. A big part of what makes this possible is the relationship that the dev team has with the community. They take community feedback very seriously and have added many suggestions such as fuel, NATO counters, and order of battle into the game. I remember making a post on the Paradox forums about adding in airdrop supply into the game. It got a decent amount of traction, and what do you know? The next update, airdropping supplies, is in the game. I thought that was really cool. And this strategy is clearly working very well for the development team. As of now, there are currently more players playing than there were at launch. And with each subsequent update, the player base only grows larger. It is not lost on me, though, that a lot of smaller studios don't have the resources that the Hearts of Iron 4 team has with Paradox backing, but it has allowed them to create what I consider the best game in the genre. Now, you might say, well, Gary Grigsby's War in the East offers a much more realistic combat simulation, and the outcomes of battles are just much more realistic. There is a little bit of jank in Hearts of Iron 4, and, well, I would have to agree with you. It is the better combat simulator, but there's absolutely no nation building, there's no diplomacy. It's one war on one front in a certain specific time period. There's really barely even any army management. And then you can also say, well, games like Stellaris, Europa Universalis, they have very advanced nation building. And yes, they do, but the warfare is kind of boring. It's just moving stacks at one another. And I think that's what Hearts of Iron 4 does so well, that's made it so popular and so good. It has a mix. You can build your nation up, you can do diplomacy, but it also has a very good and robust warfare system that's very engaging and fun to play. Currently, I probably hold a record for most hours played without any achievements. Okay, I don't play Iron Man, all right? Don't judge me. I make mistakes and I save scum, and even when I don't save scum, I just don't like to have Iron Man, all right? I don't need to justify it. Well, I kind of do. Anyways, what's really kept me in this game is the multiplayer scene and the modding. It's offered a lot of replayability. There was a time where it seemed like almost every week I would hop into a Hearts of Iron game and play for 5 or 6 hours and have a lot of fun just chatting in Discords and discussing strategy with everyone else. There was a meta, there was all these strategies. It was so much fun to be had because you could play the game in a very short form if you wanted to. You could also drag the game out for hours in a realism mod like Black Ice or Total War. When Hearts of Iron 5 comes out, if it ever does come out, it will have some quite big shoes that it needs to fill.